This week we're reading the parsha of Tzetzei. The parsha begins, Tzetzei la milchama alayvecha, unesano Hashem elokecha biyadecha v'shavisa shivyo. When you will go out to war against your enemies, and Hashem will deliver them into your hands, and you will capture its people as captives. So many of the Mefarshim talk about that this is not only in reference to an actual war, but there is a tremendous concept here about fighting with ourselves, and we have our own inner milchama. And so here, Rav Gifter, in the first piece for this week, comes from that angle and explains it, obviously, in this idea. And he points out that it says, Ki seitzei milchama levecha, when you go to war against your enemy, unesano Hashem elokecha biyadecha v'shavisa shivyo, and he will deliver him into your hands, and you will capture it as captives. So the Rav Gifter points out, if you look at it, he said, Hischil b'lashon rabim, okay? It begins with the plural, your enemies, plural, unesano Hashem elokecha, and he will be placed. Hashem, your God, will put biyadecha, shalokasav unesanam, that Hashem will place them into your hands, that they will be defeated. It was unesano, that place him. So it begins with Rabim and then changes to Yachid, to singular. Venira. And so what Rav Gifter says here is as follows. That the shoresh of all chait and any type of rebellion and any type of sinning is one. There's one culprit. Even if there are many different types of sins, there are many, many different averos, but there's one culprit, one reason why people sin, hu ha-yetzer, and it's the Yetzer Hara. Aval misgalahu lifnei adam b'hasata b'tzuros mitzuros shonos. But as we just mentioned, that the Yetzer Hara comes in many different flavors and many different colors and many different shapes and forms, but it's all one goal for us to violate what the Torah demands of us. Umilchemes hachote, and the battle of the sinner, he milchama neged oivim rabim. We're fighting many enemies. Again, there's one enemy, but this enemy is dressed in many different disguises. Aval nitzchono bazeh, but our defeat, our victory over the Yetzer Hara, shekovesh tachtav es hayetzer shu echad, it's one. When we are able to defeat the Yetzer Hara, it's the one goal is to, again, to be committed to the Dvar Hashem. V'shavisa shivyo, and you will capture its people as captives. Again, how do we understand that metaphorically? So Rashi says, and Rav Gifter here quotes Rashi, Perish Rashi, Kenanim shebetocho, to include the Canaanim who are in it. That's quoting the Medrash, that even the Canaanim, even though they're from the 7 nations, and what it means, Vishavisa Shivyo, you will capture, it should say Vishavisa Osam, and you will capture them. Why does it say Vishavisa Shivyo? You will capture him. Hainu Hashvi Shalo. It means its captivity. And the war against the Yetzer Hara, the Yetzer Hara takes from us everything good, or at least attempts to take everything good from us. And it is our responsibility to defeat the Yetzer Hara, to return everything that he took from us, and to return everything that was lost. Our job is to take the Yetzer Hara in captivity and to make sure that we return everything to its rightful owner, which means to do the right thing for the Ribbono Shel Olam. Okay, following the first parsha in the parsha, the first section in the parsha of the Eishes Yefash Toar Ki Tzetzei LaMilchama, the Torah then tells us a very interesting and strange sequence of psukim. And this is the Isha Sanua and the Isha Ahuva. The Torah tells us, okay, and here's a quote from the psukim, and we're going to learn a very famous Vilna Gaon right now. The pasuk says, Ki siyena le'ish shtei nashim. The man will have two wives. Ha'achas ahuva v'achas sanua. One is beloved and one is hated. Okay? The yoldu lo banim ha'ahuva v'asnuya, and the beloved one and the hated one bear him children. Ben habachor lasniya, and the first one will be to the hated one. So then the Torah says, b'yom hanchilo es banav, and it will be the day that he causes his son to inherit whatever will be his. Es asher yihiyeh lo yuchal levaker es ben ha'ahuva. He cannot give the right of the firstborn to the son of the beloved wife, al pnei ben hasnua habachor, over the son of the hated one who is actually the bachor. Why? The Torah continues. Kias habachor ben hasnua yakir laseis lo pishnayim, because rather, not here, ki doesn't mean because, it means rather. Ki es habachor ben asnuya yakir lo ses lo pishnayim. He must recognize the firstborn, who is the son of the hated one, to give him the double portion. B'chol asher yimatzei lo, in all that is found in him. Ki hu reishisono lo mishpara b'chora, for he is his initial vigor. To him is the right of the firstborn. Okay, he had two sons, one the Ahuva, the Snua, and the Snua is the older one. He has to be given the firstborn rights. Says the Vilna Gaon here on line 9. He says, I have a whole bunch of questions on these psukim. Achad, first of all, first question. The Torah starts off by saying that he has children from the Ahuva and the Asnua. Mashma, what do you infer from that? What do we infer from that? The way the Torah words it, the Yoldu lo banim Ahuva Asnua, Mashma shebetchila Yoldu Ahuva. It sounds like the Ahuva, the beloved wife, gave birth first. But then the Torah says that's not actually what happened. The Bechor, the firstborn, came from the Snua, from the unloved wife. Beis, second question. The Torah says that he's not able to give the right of the firstborn to the son of the beloved one. Where would you think that he could give him to be the firstborn? That all of a sudden now he'd like to do this, but he really can't do it. So the Torah says he'd like to do it. Where do we find something like that in any other mitzvah? And Gimel, says the Gra, Madua Kara Oso Snua. Why is she called a hated one, the Pshuto Shel Mikra, based on the literal translation of the pasuk? V'halo Sisna. We have a pasuk in the Torah, you're not allowed to hate anybody. So the Torah here says it's the wife that he hates. We're not supposed to hate people. That's the third question. The fourth question is, Madua Pirshalano Torah Kadosh Atam Zeh. And here the Torah specifically says, you want to make the older one the Bechor, but you can't because he's actually not the Bechor. It's the Snua's son who's the Bechor. And then the Torah says, you want to know why? Kihu Reishi Sono. He's your, as we said before, Art Scroll translates this as he is his initial vigor. Why does the Torah tell me that? He's the Bechor, he's the Bechor. Why does the Torah say, but you want to know why he's the Bechor? Because he Kihu Reishi Sono. Yosem Mirov mitzvos, more than any other mitzvos. The Torah here gives us a reason why not. Says the Gra here, we're on line 21. Amnam yesh levar. I want to explain it as follows. The Yeshloma de Mari ba'ofan kazet. The situation is as follows. And in other versions of the story, I've seen that it says that there was an actual case like this, and the Gra said this is what the psukim means. But in this version of it here, found in Kol Eliyahu, it doesn't say it actually happened, but he says this is the pshat in the psukim. Amnam yesh levar, here on line 21. The yesh lomar de mari ba'ofen kazeh. It's as follows. L'mashal, for example, Ruvain nasa isha usana usna v'garsha. Ruvain married a certain woman. He literally hated her, didn't like her, and he divorced her. A few weeks after they got married. They married for a very, very short time, just a couple of weeks, and they saw that they were incompatible, and so he divorces her. And he immediately remarries another woman. Immediately. Bine, Olo Kolish Shiva Yerachim. 7 months have passed, just 7 months have passed. The second wife gives birth. The achazia be'od yomim, lo kvirim, yolda gam ha'isha rishona agrusha gam came back. And it was just a couple of days later, his first wife, his ex-wife, also gives birth to a son. Ben Zachar, gam came Ben Zachar. She went full term, 9 months. The second wife gave birth earlier. V'hashta, but now we have a problem. Which is the firstborn son who will get the double portion? That is what the Torah HaKadosha is alluding to here. That's the remez in these psukim. Sha'garusha, the one who has been divorced, Techuna b'shem snua, we're calling her the hated one. She's not actually hated, quote unquote, but in contrast to being the wife that he loves at the moment because it's his current wife, this is his ex-wife. So the Torah calls her snua. The second one that he took is called the ahuva. In such a circumstance, the father wants the child of his beloved wife, his current wife, the wife he's married to now, to be his bechor. Al pnei ben asnua, as opposed to the son of his ex-wife. He'd want to give his son of his current wife the double portion. And logically, says the Vilna Gaon, it would make sense. Why? Which son was born first? The son of the current wife or the son of the ex-wife? Well, she gave birth after 7 months, and that child was born first. So the second wife gave birth before the ex-wife, before the first wife. Okay? Al-Kain Sivzak Torah Kadosha. That's what the Torah HaKadosha here is telling us. Ki lo yuchal avakir es ben hava. He can't give the firstborn to be the child of the beloved wife, of his current wife. However, the son of the ex-wife, the hated wife, he is the one who gets pishnayim, the double portion. And so you'll understand exactly why the ex-wife's son becomes the bechor with the double portion. Torah here on line 40, Hatam kihu reishisono lo mishpat bechora. He's the actual bechor. He's the first son. Again, the words of Art Scroll, reishisono, he's his initial vigor. Because we go after the conception, we don't go after the birth. And which child was conceived first? It was the son of the ex-wife was conceived first, therefore he's the one who gets the double portion. And the first one, who's the son of the gerusha, of the divorced one, he will inherit his father's portion and he will get the double portion. The Vilna Gaon, looking at psukim which seem very strange and enigmatic, and telling us exactly what the pshat in the psukim are. Okay, so the next section of Parshas Tzetzei, so we go from the Eishes Yefas Toar, the first beginning of the parsha, and then we go to the second section of the parsha, which is the son of the Ahuva and the Snua, and the third section in the parsha is the section on the Ben Sorer Umorer, the rebellious son. There's an interesting Gemara in Masechah Sanhedrin Daf Ayin Aleph, where the Gemara talks about Ben Sorer Umorer, and the Gemara says that Ben Sorer Umorer lo haya v'lo asad lios. It never ever happened practically that there was a Ben Sorer Umorer, and there never can be, because of the circumstances, which we'll discuss in just a moment, surrounding the requirements of who could be a Ben Sorer Umorer. What are the actual criteria that the Torah requires for a child to be a Ben Sorer Umorer? And it is almost impossible for it to ever happen. And therefore, the Gemara says, then why was it written? Drosh v'kabel schar. Learn about it, and you'll get schar, you're learning Torah. But as a practical matter, it can't happen. And that's the opinion of Rabbi Yoshia. Rabbi Yonason comes along in that Gemara, and Dafayin Aleph and Samad Aleph, and says, what are you talking about? I know it was a case of Ben Sorer Umorer, and not only was there a case, I saw his burial place. I saw where he was buried. Interestingly enough, the Gemara there gives us two other mitzvos in the Torah exactly similar. One is found in last week's parsha, the Ir Hanidachas, the city that completely worshipped Avodah Zarah, and which needs to be totally destroyed, and all the everything that's in the city to be destroyed. And the Gemara says, based on all, we'll see again in just a moment why not, but based on the requirements of what an Ir Hanidachas to be considered an Ir Hanidachas, it can never happen. Lo haya v'lo asad lios. And so what should you do? Why do we have it? Drosh v'kabel schar. And again, Rabbi Yonason says, what are you talking about? I know there was a Ben Sorer, I know there was an Ir Hanidachas, and I went to the place where it actually happened, and the mound that was after it was burnt up, I was there. And the Gemara also gives a third example of a very similar idea. That's a Bayis Hamanuga, a house that was afflicted with leprosy, tsaras, which we read about in Parshas Mitzorah a few months ago, where the Torah also says that a house can be afflicted with tsaras, and the Gemara says according to Rabbi Yoshia, it's impossible. Again, the criteria, the exact definition of what would be considered a bias hamanuga, it's realistically, practically impossible. So why do we have a Josh for Kabul Schar? And Rabbi Yonason says, what are you talking about? I saw a house that was a bias hamanuga. So Rav Schwab is going to talk about this Gemara. He's only going to talk about the first two that I mentioned, the Ben Sorer Morer and the Ir Hanidachas. So let's take a look from Ein Beis HaShoeva, Rav Schwab Sefer on Chumash, in this idea. Okay, so here we go. Line 1. Ubesanhedrin Ayin Aleph Amud Aleph Tanya. We learned in a brisa. Ben Sorer Morer lo haya v'lo asad liyos. So Ben Sorer Morer never was and never will be. And in brackets, he tells us because the Gemara requires that the father and the mother of this rebellious son have to have exactly the same pitch of their voice. They have to look alike. They have to be the same height, and that's practically never impossible. Says Rabbi Yoshia. Learn it and get schar. We're learning Torah, even though it's not a practical idea, but drosh v'kabel schar. Amar Rabbi Yonason, ani re'isav, I saw it. I saw that it actually happened. V'yashavti al kivro, and I sat at his grave. I saw his grave of this Ben Sorer Morer. V'o Tanya, and we learned in another brisa Sham in the same Gemara. Ir hanidachas lo hoysa v'lo asida lios. It never was and never will be. Why? Why can't it happen? What some of the practical reasons why it can't happen? She'ir sheyesh ba'afilu mezuzah achas eino nasas ir hanidachas. She'iev shab b'sreivas kol shlola. A city that never had one mezuzah can't become an ir hanidachas. And in Eretz Yisrael, it's not shaykh to have a city that doesn't have at least one mezuzah, and therefore it's not practical that there would ever be an Aaron Nidachas. V'lama nichtava, same question the Gemara asks, why was it written? Why was the mitzvah, the parsha of Aaron Nidachas written? Drosh v'kabel schars, because we learn it and get reward for learning Torah. Amar Rabbi Yonason said, what are you talking about? Ani re'isiya v'yashavti al tila. I saw an Ir Hanidachas, and I sat by the mound of after it was burnt. I saw where it was, where it actually was. Says Rav Schwab here at the end of line 10. I mean, Rabbi Yonason, of all the Tanaim that existed, this one Tana was the one who happened to say, you know what? I saw the grave of the Ben Sorer Morer, and I saw where there was an Ir Hanidachas. Dafka Rabbi Yonason hayabar mazol liros beis dvarim shamru chachamim shel hayu v'lo asilios. That never will be and never was, never will be. And this one Amor, the Tana, Rabbi Yonason was able to see it. What's the pshat that says that I sat at his grave, I sat on the mound, I was there? Tell me I disagree. I think it could happen. But he dafka said, not only can it happen, I was at the place that it happened. I saw the grave. I saw the area that was destroyed where the Ir Hanidachas was. Says Rav Shab, V'lulei de mistafina. If I wasn't nervous to say pshat, I would say as follows. Lulei de mistafina amina al pi divrei Chazal. He says there is a Chazal also in Masechah Sanhedrin, and if I wasn't nervous to say it, this is how I would learn pshat. The Gemara tells us, Miyom shechorav Beis Hamikdash, from the time that the Beis Hamikdash was destroyed, Af al pisha batla Sanhedrin, even though the Sanhedrin was batal, the Sanhedrin was in the on the Harabayis, and even after the Beis Hamikdash was destroyed, the Sanhedrin went to 10 different places. The Gemara tells us in Rosh Hashanah, but basically they didn't judge capital cases anymore. That's what this Gemara means. Miyom shecharav beis hamikdash afal pi shebatla Sanhedrin, even though the Sanhedrin judging capital cases was batal, they didn't do that anymore. Nevertheless, din arba misos lebatla. The din of arba misos wasn't batal. In other words, the Torah tells us that there are 4 ways that the Sanhedrin executes someone. Skila, sreifa, hereg, v'chenek. Those are the 4 ways that the Sanhedrin will execute someone. So the Gemara tells us, the Sanhedrin is no longer in session. It is no longer meeting because the Beis Hamikdash was destroyed. But the concept of skila, sreifa, hereg, and chenek is still in the world. And if someone is deserving of one of those methods of misa, so then in fact, the Ribono Shel Olam runs the world. And he will make it in a way that they would, person who is chayav, one of these methods of execution, will meet his death in this way. That's what the Gemara means. Din arba misos lo batlu. The concept of arba misos was not batal. Mishin is chayav skila, someone who is chayav skila. So what would happen? So he would, again, meet his death in a similar circumstance to what skila was. O nofel min agag, he'll fall off a roof. O chaya dorsoso, or he'll be trampled by an animal. Mishin is chayav sreifa, someone who, God forbid, is chayav the execution of sreifa. O nofel bedleika, o nachash makisho, he'll fall into a fire, or he'll be bitten by a snake. Mishin is chayav hariga, someone who's chayav to hereg. And these methods of execution will not, the Sanhedrin cannot implement them because the Sanhedrin no longer meets. But these methods will be implemented by the Ribono Shel Olam himself somehow, some way. Ukamo came. Similarly, says Rav Schwab, even though practically there can't be an Ir Hanidachas, for whatever reasons we said before, the mezuzah, etc. Kamash Malan Rabbi Yonasan. Rabbi Yonasan is teaching us, Shadin Ir Hanidachas lo batla. He says, when there's a city that is completely overtaken by Avodah Zarah, HaKadosh Baruch Hu is going to punish that city. Maybe the Sanhedrin can't punish the city because of a technicality, because of a mezuzah, whatever the reason is. But that concept of a method of getting rid of evil is still in the world. So, again here on line 21, even though in actuality, in reality, practically there's no such thing as an Ir Hanidachas, nevertheless, Rabbi Yonasan is teaching us Shadin Ir Hanidachas lo batla, that the concept of an Ir Hanidachas isn't batal. Shapam matzatel ir chareva. Once he was traveling and he found a mound of a city that was destroyed, and Rabbi Yonasan understood that this was a city that was overtaken by Avodah Zarah, and something happened to it, was destroyed, not by the Sanhedrin, but by the Ribono Shel Olam himself. V'zel Omru, Ani Re'isia v'yashafti al tila. He says, that's the pshat in the Gemara. I saw it and I sat on the mound. I sat on the place where it was originally. Shemi yeshivaso al tila chakar v'darash. He sat there, he looked at it, he thought about it, he investigated it, v'yada, and then he came to the realization. Sha'af shalom nidun alidei Beis Din, even though the Beis Din wasn't able, because again, of the practical rules and technicalities that would make it that the Sanhedrin would judge it as an Ir Hanidachas, mikol makom din Ir Hanidachas niskaima ba. but it still was considered in Shamayim and Yeranidachas, and the Ribbono Shalom took care of it. V'chein matzah kever shel ben Yud Gimel. He saw the kever of a youngster who unfortunately passed away. V'nisbarlo, and it became clear to him. Shayim misnag legamre given sorah moria. This kid was a rebellious child. So even though, again, technically, because of whatever technicality there is, that the parents have to be this, this, and this, and the Sanhedrin cannot execute a child because of that, but HaKadosh Baruch Hu, in the Beis Din Shalmala, was able to take this child, and for whatever reason happened to him, was judged as a ben sorah mora. Even though he wasn't judged in a Beis Din, because again, it couldn't happen in the Beis Din, din ben sorah mora lo batel. The concept, the idea of what a ben sorah mora is, a rebellious child, is not batel. And that's what Rabbi Yonasan is teaching us. That it's not that he happened upon it. He said that HaKadosh Baruch Hu is the one who runs the world, and since HaKadosh Baruch Hu is the ultimate judge, this is how this child or the city was being judged. Rav Schwab, in his understanding of that Gemara. Okay, later on in the parsha, we have the famous mitzvah of the Shiluach HaKain. There the Torah tells us, we all know the mitzvah of the Shiluach HaKain, where the Torah tells us that ki yikare kan tzipor lefanecha, if a bird's nest happens, somebody happens to come upon a bird's nest, baderach, b'chaletz, or ala oretz, on the road, on a tree, on the ground, efrochim o beitzim, young birds or eggs, va'emro betzas ala efrochim, and the mother is sitting on top of the birds or the eggs, lo sikach eim al banim, you shall not take the mother or the young, shaleach tishalach hasaim, you have to send the mother bird away, the es abanim tikach lach, and then you could take it. Then you can take the eggs, l'man yitav lach v'harach yom. So it will be good for you, and it will prolong your days. Rav Zalman Saratskin in the Yaznayim L'Torah, and today we're going to have another one at the end of the parsha. He says, Nifla hadavar. Says it's a wondrous thing, says Rav Saratskin. Shebachol makom chayav ba'of. In the entire Torah, we have chaya va'of. Chaya is an undomesticated animal. Va'of are birds. She'enam al pi rov mesurim b'nei adam, who under normal circumstances aren't pets, right? Even though birds could be pets in general, they are the ones, they're not necessarily pets, as opposed to a behema. Behemoths are kept by people, but under normal circumstances, birds are not kept as pets, and neither are chaya, what we call undomesticated animals. Shabakol makom chaya va'ov shavim. They're usually equated. Kamol in kisi adam. We have a halach of kisi adam that after they're shechted, their blood has to be covered up. The halacha says that the blood of an oaf has to be covered up. The blood of a chaya has to be covered up, but not of a behema. The inyan chelban shel mutter, and the chela, the fats of a chaya and oaf, are mutter as opposed to the chela of a behema. So we normally equate a chaya and an oaf together. They are very similar. The kan, but here they're not, and that's what he's going to address. The kan inyan mitzvah shiluach hakein. When it comes to mitzvah shiluach hakein, I'm sending away the mother bird. Hema chalukim. There is a distinction. And this only applies to birds. Below b'chaya, and not with chayas, not with undomesticated animals. And if you find an ayil, a ram, or a deer sitting over its small cubs, the small animals, we're allowed to take them. There's no halacha about you have to send it away. No, take it. You're allowed to do that. Question mark. Why is there a distinction? Why is there a difference? Says Rav Saratsky. V'yesh lomar. Shemin ha'ofos meshuna mikol ha'chaya v'habehema. Birds are different than chayas and behemoths, than animals. How are they different? Asher bara Hashem ba'olamam bazeh, and Hashem created. Shehem matilan beitzim v'rovtzim aleim zman yadua ad sheyotzim me'em efrochim. The way that birds give birth is different than behemoths and chayas. We're not going to talk about fish, even though there are some similarities, birds and fish. That's pushed aside. He's only talking about birds. Birds lay eggs externally and sit on the eggs, and then the eggs hatch. Behemoths and chayas don't do that. The eggs are internal. Okay? Again, she'em matilim beitzim, they lay eggs. V'rovtzim aleim zman yadua, and they sit on the eggs for a specific amount of time, until the chicks come out, until the little birds come out. As opposed to other animals. They give birth to identical animals in a much smaller version, obviously, as little cubs, as little chayas, cattle, whatever the animal is, even people. And based on this distinction, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, says Rav Saratsky, an unbelievable idea. He says, based on this, HaKadosh Baruch Hu put a specific type of love and affection, birds, on their eggs, on their quote-unquote offspring before they're hatched. They see an egg, something that has no actual life to it, or they can't see the life to it, what's inside the egg. And the egg doesn't look like the bird yet. The bird, aim, the mother, Moseres es nafsha la beitzim. She gives her life over for these eggs. V'yosheves kama shvuas, and she will sit weeks, kimat below achila shtia, without eating and drinking. Umechama masoson below hefsek, and she keeps them warm without a break. Until the chicks are hatched and they look like the mother. And therefore, her tsar is very painful. When she sees that they're taking her eggs away. That she's giving her whole soul, her whole life being to protect these eggs. And someone's coming to take them, her tsar is incomparable. And based on the love that Hashem has implanted in that has come out of her, Gadol HaTzar, it's commensurate with the tsar, the unbelievable love that she has just to protect these eggs is in proportion to the tsar she'll feel if these eggs are taken away. Im tira barasam, if something bad happens to these eggs. Halal tira shechazra Torah beis pamim b'parshazeh alafrochim al beitzim. When the Torah is talking about it, it says efrochim o beitzim. It says the chicks or the eggs. Lashmiya, to teach us, to inform us. Shemeshuna avas atzipor l'toldoseh mishar ba'alechayim b'zeh. That the love that a mother bird has for its eggs is different than all other members of the animal kingdom. Shahat sipor moseres es nafsha afilu b'shah shel toldoseh eitzer eina kayotze ba. That she's giving over her life to protect these eggs, even when it's not similar to herself. When it's still eggs. totally different than what she is and what the chick will be. Even though there's a famous Mishnah in Maseches Megillah and Maseches Brachos that Ha'omer, somebody in davening says, Al Kansipor Yagir Rachamecha, that your mercy even extends to a bird's nest. Mishtakim also, we tell them to be quiet and we remove him from being the Chazan. Ein zadafka mitam rachmanas al xeris hamelech melech malchei amlochem HaKadosh Baruch Hu, because we say that HaKadosh Baruch Hu is a Rachaman, and if somebody says that, look how HaKadosh Baruch Hu protects his creatures because of Al Kansipa Yagir Rachamecha, we shut him up, we remove him. Zeharak Omer came b'tfilasa. That's if he says it in davening. Because a person can't say these things in davening. HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the mitzvahs that HaKadosh Baruch Hu gave us, they are much more than because of Rahmanas. And therefore, we don't let a person say that in davening. Aval, says Rav Sorotzkin to conclude, Aval mikevin she'ayin panim l'Torah, since we know that every aspect of Torah has 70 different facets to it, Mutter lomer tam shonim l'mitzvah. We're allowed to try to attempt to give reasons for mitzvos, but don't say this is the only reason. A person gets up in davening and says that's the reason for mitzvos, we're telling him to be quiet. But there obviously are many aspects to the mitzvah, and therefore this is an unbelievable concept about the mother, the love the mother has for eggs when it is just an egg, and it's not anything resembling what it will be when after the egg will hatch. The Torah tells us, continuing in the parsha, Torah tells us about getting married, the mitzvah of getting married. Torah says that there's a mitzvah of to be married. And then who is not allowed to be married? The Torah says, Lo yovo mamzer bekal Hashem, gam dor asiri lo yovo lo bekal Hashem. A mamzer shall not enter the congregation of Hashem. Even the 10th generation shall not enter the congregation of Hashem. The Torah then says, Lo yovo amoni moavi bekal Hashem, etc., etc. So Rav Yaakov Kamenetsky and Emes Yaakov is wants to give a very interesting thought on this specific mitzvah, but a overview of the entire Sefer Dvarim. Okay, listen to what he says. He says, I'm curious in general, since, as we just mentioned, that the mitzvah to get married is mentioned in Parshas Tzetzei, and not only that, the mitzvah of get, of the concept of a get, is mentioned in Parshas Tzetzei. The Torah here tells us that you're not allowed to marry a mamzer, a Moni, and a Moavi. He says, what's it doing here in Sefer Dvarim? Halo biarti b'kam makomos, says back in Sefer Parsha Shoftim, we read last week. Ulahalon b'Parshas Vayelech, we're going to read in a couple of weeks Parshas Vayelech. What's going on here in Sefer Dvarim? The be'emes, Sefer Dvarim hu Sefer hanogea lemelech u'leinyonei tzibur. Sefer Dvarim is really the Sefer that talks about the king. That was in Parsha Shoftim, last week's Parsha, and it talks about mitzvos of Klal Yisrael as a community, as a nation. V'hainu, what is that? Shemoshe ba'amdo ba'arvos Moav. Moshe Rabbeinu, where is he saying Sefer Dvarim? They're standing at the plains of Moab, right opposite the Jordan River. Moshe Rabbeinu knows, realizes he's not crossing the Jordan into Eretz Yisrael. So Moshe Rabbeinu, in his final speech, which is what Sefer Dvarim is reviewing and talking about the mitzvahs that are incumbent upon Klal Yisrael as they're entering, and to set up the nation of Klal Yisrael, set up Eretz Yisrael as a society. And all the laws of war and justice. Kadesha HaMelech HaChodesh B'nai Yisrael Yodu Ma La'asos Miksanim L'Eretz Yisrael. So the king, the new king, and B'nai Yisrael will know what to do as they're entering the land. We're setting up the society. We're setting up the Jewish people living here in Eretz Yisrael. So I have to give you the rules. That's what Sefer Dvarim is all about. But there are certain anomalies to that, certain things that sound a little funny, because we find, as we just mentioned, the mitzvah of getting married, the mitzvah of yibum, the mitzvah of get, certain people you can't marry. That's all found here only in Sefer Dvarim. It's not found in the other Sfarim. You want to talk about the arayos, who you can marry, can't marry? That's back in Sefer Vayikra, in the parshas of Achrei Mos and Kedoshim. What is who you can marry, can't marry, and getting married and get? What is that doing here in Sefer Dvarim? Says Rav Yaakov Kamenetsky, an unbelievably important insight. Avol nira mizeh. He says, I'm going to tell you the pshat is as follows. She'inyan hanesua meitzel b'nei Yisrael. The concept of marriage by b'nei Yisrael eino inyan prati hanogea l'shnei atzdadim u'mishpachtem ulvad. A marriage within the Jewish people is not something individualistic, private, that has to do just with the bride and groom and their respective families. Elo hu nogea l'kahal kulo. It is something that is nogea to the entire congregation. Not only to the entire congregation, to the entire Jewish people as a unit. Shal yidei nisuav nichnas habacher l'kal Yisrael v'niyeh kechelech me'atzibur. When a marriage takes place, this new family enters into Klal Yisrael, and we are now bringing a new family into the Jewish people. It is a public celebration because we're welcoming a new member of the collective Jewish family. Therefore, someone who you're not allowed to marry, a mamzer, a moni, a moavi is someone who you can't marry, is referred to as what? As a psulei kahal. He's puzzled to come into the kahal. He's puzzled to join the congregation. He's puzzled from being part of the kahal. And he has to remain like he was prior to this. Yachid la'atzmo, an individual. All the laws that are applicable, this mi mutter, masai mutter, ve prate hadrim nasim, the halachos that apply, who you can marry, when you can get married, and all the details, that is part of being part of the tzibur. Because Sefer Dvarim is the Sefer of the Tzibur. It's the community. It's now we're starting up the society. Well, what's the most important part of the society is having a continuation of that society. And how do we continue that society? It's through families, Jewish family. So a Jewish family entering is a public celebration. It's not only a private thing. And this is exactly the place that it belongs in Sefer Dvarim. And that's the reason that if there's a chassan and a shul, something that we all know, that there's a chassan who shows up in shul during the 7 days of his Sheva Brachos, what happens? The whole shul is patur from saying tachan. An ovel, if a person Rachmana litzlan lo aleinu davens in an ovel's house, so there's no tachna in an ovel's house. But if, let's say, there's no minyan in the ovel's house, and the ovel's coming to shul, so halach is that they're not patur from saying tachna, and they still say tachna. The ovel himself won't say it, but the shul still says tachna. Why the difference? It's pashut, because the marriage is a communal celebration. And unfortunately, the Avelis is for the person who's sitting Avelis, but that's not a public manifestation of mourning. The simcha of the chassan is not only his own simcha, it's the simcha of the entire tzibur. The kula niftarim milomar tachlan, and therefore everybody's exempt from saying tachlan. Machma shazui simchasam mamash. And not only for the chassan, but it's a simcha for the entire community, because that's what simchas chassan and kal is. It's a celebration of the community. And as we mentioned before, we will have another thought from Rav Salman Saratskin from the Asnaim LaTorah. The last section of Parshas Tzetzei are the 3 psukim that tell us to remember the event of Amalek attacking us that we read on Parsha Zachar, Zachar es asher lecha Amalek. So Rav Saratskin is going to point out something about Amalek and its uniqueness, that how it affects us. So Rav Saratskin writes, Zachar es asher lecha Amalek baderech. Rav Saratskin also wrote a sefer on essays, which is called Hadei v'Hadibur, and again, it's a book of essays. So he writes here, B'Hadei v'Hadibur chelik beis, daf beis, be'arnu es ha'parsha zos betuv v'tam u'barichas. He spends a substantial amount of time discussing these 3 psukim about Amalek. But very briefly, the Dayakan Diyuka Machadim. I'm going to give you a synopsis, a little idea of things that he wrote over there. And if you want to see that, Hadei v'Hadibur, you should look that up. But here he's just going to mention a couple of things about the concept of what happened and what we need to understand about the attack of Amalek against us. Echad. First of all, HaTorah she'asras hanakima v'hanatira. The Torah is very much against revenge. Torah tells us back in Parshas Kedoshim, Sefer Vayikra, we're not allowed to take revenge. So revenge is not something that is a Jewish trait. Nevertheless, I want you to remember what they did to you. Timcha Zecher Amalek. You have to erase the memory of Amalek. Lo tishchak, don't ever forget it. So the same Torah that prohibits us from taking revenge is telling us, but don't forget what they did to you. That's question number 1. Question number 2, Baderech. If you look at the psukim, it says, Baderech, on the road, as you were leaving Egypt. Asher karcha baderech, and that happened upon you on the way. Okay? Asher baderech, asher karcha baderech, u'meshulish b'neviim. And if you look in Sefer Shmuel, the Haftorah of Parsha Zachar, where the Torah tells us, Pakadati is asher asa Amalek b'Yisrael. I remember what Amalek did to the Jewish people. Asher shamlo baderech, on the road. Why does the Torah emphasize that you were on the road? What's the necessity to mention you on the road? And Gimel, the third question, why does it have to say, as you left Egypt? Why is that relevant? And not only is it mentioned here in Parshas Tzetzei, in that parak in Navi and Shmuel, again, Haftorah, Parshas Zachar, it's also mentioned. It says, Ba'alo Somni Mitzrayim, when you came up from Egypt. So how do we understand what's going on here? Vine, Hevanu Sham Mizorah Kadosh. She says, if you look in my essay in Hadei v'Hadibur we brought from the Zohar, basically the following idea. She'amalek nilchamas b'Yisrael al pi pekuda misamal. Amalek was fighting based on the instructions from Samal. Who's Samal? What's Samal? It's the Yetzer Hara. It's the Yetzer Hara. And that is who Amalek is. Amalek is the personification of the Yetzer Hara. Sheyorad la'ezros Amalek, Saro b'shamayim, that's his master in heaven. We'll skip the parentheses. Sharatza l'noar sisum b'kabolas haTorah v'hesis b'kocho ba'aretz. The goal here, Amalek, under the instructions of the Yetzer Hara of Samuel, of that angel, that evil angel in Shamayim, wanted to prevent Klal Yisrael from receiving the Torah and to take away the power of Torah from the world. As Amalek he sent Amalek to fight Klal Yisrael in Refidim. What's Refidim? As Rashi tells us back there, it was Refidim Sharafu Yedeim min Torah. He tried to weaken our hands from accepting, from learning, and from accepting the Torah al Yedei Samal, through the actions of the Yetzer Hara. Hatachana Hachrona Lifnei Har Sinai. That was the last stop on their way to Har Sinai. The Refidim on the road after they left Mitzrayim, on their way to Har Sinai, the last stop they were at before they got to Har Sinai was what? Was Refidim. And that's where Amalek attacked. It says Baderech. Zechor es asher solachol Amalek. Baderech, on the path. Habeiz bepatach. Baderech b'makom hei hayediyah. The road. It's a specific road. Ritzono lomar baderech hayedua, on that well-known road. And what road are we talking about? Haderech lekabbalas haTorah, the road to receive the Torah. And we know the Torah is called derech. HaTorah ikri derech. Shenemar es haderech yelchu ba, on the path that we follow. And that path is the path of Torah. What is it called when we follow the Torah? It's called halacha. We follow the Torah. We walk in the ways of the Torah. It is our derech. It is our way. Baderech, that path. That was prepared for us to travel on from the 6 days of creation, from the beginning of time. As we know, Chazal tell us, "Im yikablu b'nei Yisrael Torah mutav." If Klal Yisrael will accept the Torah, good. And if they refuse the Torah, so achzir es ha'olam tov avo. HaKadosh Baruch Hu said, "I will return the world to nothingness." Right? We learned that in Vayhi Erev Vayivoka Yom Hashishi, the 6th day. The whole creation was for the sake of Kabbalas HaTorah. Baderech, on the road, on the path. Shehi Haisa Materes Yitzias Mitzrayim. That's the goal of Yitzias Mitzrayim. What did HaKadosh Baruch Hu tell Moshe Rabbeinu at his first encounter at the Sneh in Mitzrayim? When I take you out of Egypt, you will serve God on this mountain. That's the goal. You're leaving Egypt not just to gain your freedom, but I'm taking you out so you will become the Eved of Hashem. You will become plural, the Avodim of Hashem. Nimtza. So what do we see from this? Shamulchamazu, this war of Amalek attacking Klal Yisrael Baderech. Okay? It wasn't a physical war. It wasn't they wanted territory or they wanted some other reason why they attacked. They want to take some, there's no reason to remember that. The attack of Amalek was for the soul of the Jewish people. Milchemes Amal, it's the fight of the Yetzer Hara, al Yedei Amalek, through Amalek, Netzigo Ba'aretz. It's Amalek is the Yetzer Hara's representative in this land, and we can say it both ways. Amalek is the Yetzer Hara. The Yetzer Hara is Amalek. Am Yisrael Lemnoa Osam Berega Achim Kabbalas HaTorah. He wanted to prevent Klal Yisrael from receiving the Torah. Al davar zeh anu mitzuvim. That's the mitzvah. Zachor lo tishkach. Remember, do not forget. Ki milchama zu lo nischalav ligmaru az. It didn't begin then, and it didn't end then in the midbar at Refidim. The yameh kimei shemayim al haaretz, and its days are eternal. Milchama Lashem ba'Amalek midor dor. The fight, the war of Amalek is from generation to generation. Miyamos Adam Arishon. From the days of Adam Arishon it began. Shesiso Samal Lavar Mitzvos Hashem. What happened to Adam in Gan Eden? The Yetzer Hara wanted him not to listen to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And unfortunately, he succumbed. He gave in. He sinned with the Yetzer Das. Chava, the Nachash, sinned with the Yetzer Das, Adam Arishon. The Yetzer Hara has his fangs within us. It began way back in Gan Eden. Mimei ha'avos hakadoshim prat mimei Yaakov. And specifically, the Avos, and especially with Yaakov Avinu, shenisavek imo aralos hashachar. He fought with the Yetzer Hara, with the Sar Shalesach, with Samuel, until dawn. Sha'az yarchik Hashem es sifune v'yivar ha'ram haaretz. When the dawn arrives, HaKadosh Baruch Hu will get rid of this Yetzer Hara, and the evil will be destroyed from the world. Lefichach hidgisha b'Torah baderech. That's what the Torah emphasizes, this concept of baderech u'b'seischem mitzrayim, and on the way going to Egypt. That's why we have a mitzvah to remember this war constantly, always. Lo tishkach, never forget what Amalek represents, what Amalek is, what Amalek tried to do to us.